but we're going to talk about groundwater, that part of our water resources arena that we can't see but do enjoy tremendously. 2 years ago, almost to the date, Governor Brown passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and we're going to look at where we are in the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Act. The Sustainable Groundwater Act set out with two very foundational principles for its implementation. One was that it explicitly mandates that groundwater as a resource be managed sustainably for future enjoyment of next generations. The other one, equally important, is that groundwater be managed locally. And that's going to be a very big part of its implementation. Sustainability in the Groundwater Management Act is defined by what I call the 6 commandments. Thou shalt not draw down your water level and deplete your storage. Thou shalt not degrade water quality. Thou shalt not have seawater intrusion. Thou shalt not have subsidence or grab somebody else's surface water. And in implementing these goals, the state set out to mandate that local agencies form groundwater sustainability agencies by 2017, the end of June of next year, very soon. And they're given 3 years in the case of overdrafted basins and 5 years in the case of non-overdrafted basins that are medium and high priority to implement what is called a groundwater sustainability plan. Now that plan, unlike our former groundwater management plans, is not a plan to plan some more, but a plan to implement. And the implementation is going to have, I like to call it 4 bullets. There's sort of 4 principal pieces. One is sort of the data management, the assessment, monitoring, modeling, understanding the groundwater basin. That's one piece. Another very important piece is to engage local stakeholders, which is really a new piece of this. And then when it comes to the actions, there's going to be conservation, reduction of groundwater use, but also increasing the amount of recharge that's going into groundwater. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was in many ways a revolution, and we haven't really seen a major water legislation that has such profound consequences in 50 years, 40 years. That's maybe only happened twice in the last century. One was when we had the water rights legislation in 1914 and created a predecessor to the State Water Board. And the other one was Porter Cologne Water Quality Control Act in 1969. So this is a revolution, and it's a revolution in particular for our agricultural areas. And we have a very distinguished panel to discuss some of the questions and on how are we doing with this, where are we going with this, and I wanted to first introduce our panel and then set off with questions. Eric Everett comes from Kern County. He's the general manager of the Rosedale Rio Bravo Storage District since 1991. He's also the chair of the Kern River Watershed Coalition and the manager of the Kern Groundwater Authority. Those offices span both water supply management and water quality management in a heavily agricultural region. Lots of cross-experience between those two arenas. Next to Eric is Thad Bettner, General Manager of Glen Colusa Irrigation District. Thad is also the chair of the Association of California Water Agencies Water Management Committee and plays very critical role in local groundwater management and surface water management, very involved in the Sites Reservoir Joint Powers Agreement. And finally, it is my honor to introduce Secretary of Department of Food and Agriculture, Karen Ross, appointed by Governor Brown in 2011. She brings a lot of experience at not just the state, but also national, international level in agriculture to her role. She was the Chief of Staff for U.S. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack, and before that she was President of the California Association of Wine Grape Growers. Welcome, everyone. Well, let's get started with that introduction. How are we doing on the implementation of SGMA? Where are we on the state level? Where are we on the local level?
Well, let me just comment. You made reference to the revolution of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and as we go out and we have discussions with stakeholders throughout the area, it does feel like a revolution, more like the French Revolution. People are not happy with the message that we're communicating. But to Thomas's question, you know, it's hard to assign a grade. The first report card that we're going to get will actually come out on June 30, which is the date that the basins throughout the state have to have identified a groundwater sustainability agency. And that's the entity that will step forward and be responsible for preparing a groundwater sustainability plan. If I were to assign a grade at this point, I would say we're probably at the local level a D. And that's primarily because at a recent meeting, Mark Norberg with the Department of Water Resources indicated we only have about 20% of the basins that have the necessary coverage. Now, I think what happens is human nature is we'll send them in on June 29th and hopefully have 100% of the coverage. So on the local level, I think we're still trying to get our arms around what's required. The other part of the GSA is in a basin full of type A personalities. It's what I call the everybody, somebody, nobody dilemma. Everybody's going to act as a GSA because they're afraid somebody else is going to, but really nobody wants to. The last thing, as far as the state goes, I have to make sure to acknowledge the efforts that the state have made. Both DWR and the State Water Board have done an amazing job, not only in their outreach and trying to communicate the various components and the requirements of the plans or the act itself, but also in drafting regulations that I think will do an excellent job in helping us move forward. So I would say the state's getting an A, and we have yet to see at the local level.
So I'll maybe change that from a French Revolution maybe to some sort of a race, but nobody knows what kind of race it is yet. You know, I'd say there's, we're trying to get everybody to the starting line and really kind of say we need to get going and get everybody on the same page of what do we know, what don't we know, what does everybody want out of this process. And we have, you know, people who already left the starting line or, you know, halfway through the race thinking I got this, I'm going to win this thing. We have some people who are close to the line, some people are, you know, putting their clothes on, and some people haven't know there's a race going on yet. So it's really, you know, our challenge is to kind of bring people along and say, you have to engage. I mean, everybody has to be a part of this, like Eric was saying. And so I think part of our message, and, you know, a lot of us are type A people, of how do we get this thing going, but acknowledging that we have to go at the right pace to bring on a lot of stakeholders. And, you know, there's just a lot of people that don't even know what this legislation really says, or, you know, a lot of it's emotions at this point. The data, while we have some data, it's pretty weak, and to get the data into the discussion to start making some solid decisions going forward is going to take a lot of money. And we, you know, the previous panel talked about Prop 218 and, you know, what a challenge it is to get dollars, but, you know, I think that's going to be one of the issues. So, you know, you try and put all this together and say, yeah, where are we? I'm going to go, maybe we're C-, we're a little bit better than you guys. But yeah, I mean, I think we're getting there, but it's a challenge, but I think it's also a huge opportunity. I think every time we have meetings, you know, you kind of walk away a little bit frustrated, but also walk away that, hey, we've made progress, it's a good thing, and this is going the right direction.
Thank you for that. Karen?
So my analogy is this is a marriage amongst parties who have never even dated before. And that's the challenge of bringing together all the stakeholders and just things that are very fundamental to making something this big work, and that is trust. And how do we create trust so that everyone will be engaged and come to the same level of understanding of what we have, what the options are, how those scenarios will play out. So I'm glad you mentioned DWR has done a great job of getting out, you know, the criteria and some of the things we'd be looking for in a plan, which some people were waiting for to see what is our GSA going to look like. There is this need to, until I trust what's going on and I have access to my data, there's everybody wanting to be a GSA, and that's going to come home to roost when they all have to put together a plan and make sure that they've got the basin covered. So it's very, very challenging. And we also know that in some of the communities, and I'll use the agricultural community, I'm not sure how many farmers are as engaged as they should be, knowing what the impact is going to be. And part of that is because they're so overwhelmed with lots of other things that are impacting their lives and their livelihoods right now. Many of them still confuse this with the irrigated ag lands program. Many of them in the valley right now are really focused on the flows thing. So just having the space to pay attention to that. They know they have drinking water issues and they're involved in some of those solutions. So and this brings it all together. I mean, that would be bringing it all together. This, for the first time, really does bring land use into the discussion in a way that hasn't always been there. And so the interesting part of that is that we've got water managers who know how to water manage, and then you have boards of supervisors who all of a sudden are going, but how's that going to impact my land use? What is that going to impact my community for development, not just the agricultural economy? These are really big questions that some people are just now coming to terms with. So it is a very, very difficult thing. It's a lot of social behavior. How do we facilitate this? It's the need to build trust. But the opportunity is to build community in a very deep kind of way, because it is embracing the diversity of our community, including everyone in our community, and coming to some solutions together. I think it also creates the opportunity to better connect the urban, or even in our rural communities, those cities and those rural areas, to think about this molecule of water and how we all can use it and be a part of the solution.
Thank you, Secretary Ross. I wanted to kind of elaborate a little bit on, for those of you that are not familiar with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, the two agencies at the state level have been given sort of the role of being the main overseers on the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. The Department of Water Resources is the primary agency developing regulations on what are the specific expectations for the groundwater sustainability plan, what elements do have to be in the groundwater sustainability plans. DWR will also be essentially reviewing these plans and deciding whether they're good enough or not. DWR has been given the role of providing technical assistance as well. The State Water Resources Control Board is more of the agency that steps in when plans are not moving forward, when GSAs are not being formed. And it's basically there with the threat to step in and have the state take over the local basin. And that has provided much of the motivation for a lot of local agencies that otherwise may have not thought about becoming an agency to get involved. How much of a threat is that stick, which actually is Chapter 11 in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act? How much has that motivated it? And maybe you can also speak a little bit, as we've gone through about 2 years now of moving towards this, beyond just the grade that we're getting on where we are at the state level and the local level. For you personally, you're all very engaged in this process. Any surprises, any insights or lessons learned from just these initial 2 years of being in this process? Anything that's striking you?
Yeah, if you've seen the movie 50 First Dates, raise your hand. Almost everybody has. And so every time I go to a Groundwater Authority board meeting, it's like that movie, where I have to repeat and say, yes, this is real. Yes, we have to do this. And so the surprise is I don't want to say the lack of engagement. I think that people have a grasp of what's coming. The dilemma is we don't know how to solve it. And so it hasn't become real yet. And so it will on June 30 when we start stepping forward and raising our hands and acting as the GSAs. But I think what we're seeing is, and I think Karen touched on this, the regulatory fatigue. They have so many issues in front of them from the agricultural perspective that this is just one more, and it will not become real until, unfortunately, and this is just the reality, until the state board steps in and does define a basin as probationary, and then all of a sudden people will wake up and they'll say, oh, I better pay attention to what's going to happen. And that's unfortunate, because there will be some examples made somewhere within the state. But the state board as a backstop has certainly been a motivator, and I think it's gotten people engaged. It's just translating that theoretical, okay, I understand that there's this requirement, to the practical, which is sitting down and starting to develop solutions and facilitating and whatnot. The other thing that I would say that surprises me, and again, I can only speak for the Kern area, is there's been extensive outreach with some of the smaller communities, and so we have within Kern, which I'm sure is similar to up and down the Central Valley, a number of smaller cities that don't have the staffing or the resources to really bring to bear to such a significant issue. And unfortunately, many of these cities are 100% reliant on groundwater. And I think to the extent that SGMA is moving forward, they have one of the higher or the larger hills to climb, and they haven't really started to engage yet, notwithstanding the fact that we've met with them through a variety of venues and tried to grab their attention. Again, I think it's a function of they have so many issues that they're dealing with that this is just on their shelf, and they recognize that they're going to have to pull it down at some point, but they haven't engaged yet. And so that's one of the biggest concerns that I have, is moving forward, how do we engage all of the stakeholders in a way that values their input, that brings them to the table. My biggest concern is that we'll move forward, and then at some point they're going to say, hey, wait a sec, you forgot about me, and I have issues X, Y, and Z, and we have to pull back or re-engage. So,
Can I just pick up on that, because it's a very important point, and that is one of the reasons we're in this dilemma, and in the severe way that we are, is because of changes in the operations of our system for surface water deliveries. And so those entities who have some surface water have been the first to step up, and they're very confident about what they're going to be able to do. And they've got the irrigation districts, some of them are very small, or the small city that's completely dependent upon groundwater in or out of a drought. And they don't want to completely embrace them right now until they know, and what are you going to be willing to do? Where's your land fallowing program? Whatever it might be. That's harsh. And so that not having a resource to come to the table, let alone the data or the investment dollars, to feel like an equal partner is going to be a hard thing to get over, to really have everyone feel like we are in this together, where all the equity part's going to be shared here. And those are just fundamental changes in that society, that particular community.
I think for us, I'm up in our district's up in the Sacramento Valley. We have one basin, the Sacramento Basin, if you will, and then a bunch of sub-basins. We're part in the Colusa sub-basin, which I think is the largest basin in the Sac Valley and maybe even the San Joaquin Valley. And now we have 3 different counties. Each one of the counties wants to have its own process for forming GSAs. To either they want to be a GSA themselves, or the districts or eligible agencies in those counties want to do it. And so you got, and then you have all these sub-basins have their different issues of, are they in overdraft or not, and is it districts, is it private pumpers, and and yet everybody's got to communicate. And I think Secretary Ross, I think the key button really here is trust. Of how do you start to build trust somewhere to start that process going, because hopefully it's going to be infectious in all the other areas once there's one area of the community that's working together. And so one of the things that we did, and we kind of did it recently, was until people start putting their cards on the table of what they want out of SGMA, what they want out of the GSA process, everybody's going to sit there and kind of say, well, I want to make sure I can outvote the other party. If we get down to a vote, I want the power. I want to retain this, I want to retain that. And what we did was we pulled all of the districts, the eligible GSA districts, out of 3 counties who were part of the Colusa Subbasin, and we said we need to get together and we need to get on the same page, and we need to be willing to tell everybody else what we're looking for out of SGMA. So we put together a list of principles on governance. We put together a list of principles on what we're looking for in terms of future water supply reliability, and that included what we view as the perspective groundwater law. We also know that flows are coming up with the state board on the Sacramento River and the Sacramento River system. How does that play into SGMA? And we were very just forthright with what we wanted. We went and talked to boards of supervisors, and said, here's our position. And then now we're starting to put that into our governance discussions that, DWR has a facilitator in our 2 counties, Glenn and Colusa County, to start telling the private pumpers and other folks who aren't, so it can be GSAs, here's what we're looking for. And what we're asking for you to do is you put your cards on the table and say, what are you looking for, and see if we can figure out, can we make this work or not? And instead of trying to form governance that would say we got to deal with 1,000 different things and make sure we always win in a vote, maybe we can narrow that down to like 5 things and say, here are the 5 key issues that we need to have governance to deal with. And maybe there's some uber body that makes the big decisions, but really it still needs to be everything needs to be done at the local level, at local parts of the basin. So we're hopeful that that's kind of a way to kick off some of these discussions. And, we see, probably going to where this forms some sort of an agreement to form governance. Maybe we don't get an actual governance structure by not June, excuse me, but we have an agreement that says, hey, all the parties at the table, we're committed to working this out. Here are the issues we want to deal with. And from that, we have more robust governance structure going forward.
Can you talk a little bit more about that governance structure and what kind of, or the diversity of governance structures we may see? Maybe Eric, you can say something to that as well.
Sure. So the Groundwater Authority actually formed, we started in 2012 as a management committee. Kern had some groundwater challenges, water level declines, and we brought all the water interests within the county together informally under a management committee. In anticipation of SGMA, we actually formed a JPA. What was interesting is, as you circulate the JPA to the various members, they struck out all the authority of the JPA. So it's a joint powers authority with absolutely no authority.
It's the best kind.
Yeah, we don't want you to do this, and so, yeah. So with the passage of SGMA, we realized that we actually do have to implement some authority. There's a very strong sense that that the decision making and the responsibility needs to be at the membership level, and we're taking. I don't know if it's a unique approach, but the governance that we've structured allows the Groundwater Authority to act as both a coordinating entity, which is very, very critical in the SGMA process, and so. But it also can act on behalf of its members in the capacity of a GSA. If it does so, however, it will defer or delegate the responsibility to prepare the plan back to the member. And so it's kind of this super coordinating administrative entity, but the power, as long as the member chooses to yield the power, it will, or the member can actually delegate to the authority to do that. And so we've tried to create this organizational structure that meets the requirements of the state, that you coordinate and that you have a responsible entity, but yet also preserve the autonomy and the authority that the membership felt was very, very important. And we hope that through that process we'll avoid having 50, because there's 50 entities within Kern County that could act in the capacity of a GSA. And in some cases they are multi-layered, and so within my own water district there's 3 entities that could act as the GSA. And so we're hopeful that we can consolidate that and we can create an environment where people feel like, okay, I do have a voice, somebody else isn't going to dictate or mandate what I do. And so this particular approach we think will work for us.
I wanted to add on that, as we did all of these meetings, to get a lot of the guidelines out and meet the deadlines that the state had, I was taken by surprise by how many early filings of, I'm going to be the GSA there was. And it's like, this is going to be a problem. And what we're trying to do is there has to be that flexibility and the understanding that as long as you're making forward progress and you're showing that, and the real test will be if you can knit your basin together. So that balance of supporting some of this trust building and making this work and getting everybody at the table and on the pathway to meeting the benchmarks and the timelines. The state board, I love to put words in my sister agencies' mouths, but the state board, the chair in particular, has said, we're not going to go after you if you're really that deeply engaged, you're making forward progress, you've met certain kinds of deadlines. We're going to look for those people who really haven't even gotten started, who just can't make something work, that, there's, how do you create enough flexibility to let this process work? Because if we don't let the process work, there won't be the trust. Putting together the plan will be a failure. So it's a hard thing when you pass a law that deals so much on the behaviors of everybody coming together to make really hard decisions about your livelihood, your quality of life, your drinking water, the environment, and the health of our streams. I mean, so that's, how do you balance that? I wish I had the answer. I could go out and be a consultant.
Yeah. Thad, any thoughts on governance structures?
No,
that
I
you
mean,
see
I would,
in the diversity of governance structures, or maybe it's all the same.
I think kind of Eric and Neil, I think we're kind of looking at the same thing, kind of some probably joint powers authority that would, again, trying to utilize everybody's powers that they have. They retain the power as long as they use it. If they don't, then the JPA would come in and basically trump them and say, you're not doing what you're supposed to do to maintain sustainability, and so we're taking over the bus, I think.
Basins, probably.
Right, yeah, and I think the other thing we're also trying to do is, as I mentioned earlier, we just need a lot of data to get this thing going. You know, there's so much, I think, you know, or I believe it's, well, let's use facts, you know, to start making better decisions. And so, you know, the other thing we want to try and do is, you know, the counties in our region, I mean, they don't have any money. And to say, hey, we need to bring $1 million into each one of these counties to start getting these studies going to adequate water balances, to be able to have each landowner at a landowner or parcel level understand how they're, you know, benefiting or impacting the groundwater system or streams. I mean, that takes a lot. It's pretty data intensive. And so what we're also trying to do is say, hey, how can districts, you know, try and front some of the money to get these studies going, you know, give that money to the county, or we want to make sure the county is kind of lead so it doesn't appear to be tainted by, you know, private pumpers or something like that. But how do we get that money going so we can get these studies going to make sure we're using, you know, facts and science and data to help drive some of the decisions in the GSP?
Yeah, that's a great point. Before I go further down on the money side, I was going to ask Secretary Ross. DWR and State Water Board have both very central roles in the implementation, but agriculture is going to be a heavy lifter in this, being 80% of the groundwater use in the state. What is the role of Department of Food and Agriculture in this?
Begging?
You got the consultant role,
No,
right?
this is like many things. It's like agriculture is the nexus to everything, and so my department has no statutory authority in this. So once again, I'm here, I'm at the table, and it's really, I see our role as supporting. We're very involved right now through the executive order with the ag water management plans and providing input and data on that. It's facilitating, it's going out. I've done a lot of one-on-one meetings or bringing people together on a countywide basis to be supportive of this. But we have no defined role in this, and yet the impact for us is huge. And one of the things that I think about, and we won't be here in 2 years, is we will be at a point where some of these communities, the impacts are going to be severe. And I know one of the questions you're going to ask is how to get some of these basins into balance. We need to be thinking as we do this about these rural communities and the significant change that's coming there, and think smarter about what is that workforce, what are those small towns dependent upon, what are some concurrent things we should be doing through workforce development, through any type of community development. Those are going to be real impacts, and it's a lot to put on the front part of this process, but I feel like I have to bring those up and make sure that we're putting some planning process and supporting process in there.
Yeah, and so let's think about this a little bit further. You know, as we do next year, we have these GSAs, hopefully most of them, and then we're going to go into this process of building groundwater sustainability plans, and that's, you know, as you said, it's data, understanding the water budget, and to the degree that there's overdraft, bringing that water budget into balance, either by increasing the amount of water that goes into the groundwater basin or by decreasing the amount that's taken out. Where are, at the local, in these agricultural basins that you represent, what is the thinking around where to create that balance where you're out of balance? Kern County certainly has significant overdraft issues. There's a few local places in the Sacramento Valley. But the Sacramento Valley may have other issues that are going to come to the forefront that are sort of forced through the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that we've really never looked at, which is that groundwater surface water interface and how groundwater pumping impacts our surface water resources and impacts groundwater dependent ecosystems. How do you see us dealing with this in terms of actual projects once we have the data and understanding this? Is there a sense of where this may be going? Eric?
Project. California needs a water project, and so for Kern County, and I'll just give you some numbers because it is significant, and it's up and down the Central Valley. If you've ever seen the DWR map, it shows the critically overdrafted basins are all in the Central Valley. And for Kern County, if we don't develop additional water supplies, we will lose 25% of our irrigated agriculture. That's $4 billion for Kern annually in lost economic output. But I want to put that into context because I think it's important, and I've made this comment in other venues. When SGMA, I'm a strong supporter of SGMA. I think it was necessary legislation. But to put it into context, I thought when I first started getting involved in groundwater issues that the agricultural sector was the architect of its own issue. And I can only speak for Kern County, but I started looking at, well, what has happened? And I thought, well, we've increased our cropped acreage. In 1967-68, Kern County signed up for the contract with the State Water Project for 1 million acre feet. In 1980, DWR identified Kern as overdrafted basin, but it had a statement that said, to the extent that Kern County can receive 100% of its State Water Project supplies, it will not be overdrafted. So I went into 2013 and I looked at the level of irrigated acreage on the Agricultural Commissioner's website. We actually had 20,000 acres of less irrigated land in 2013 than we did in 1980. The demand has changed. It has shifted to trees and other crops from cotton and row type crops. But it's no accident that the level of overdraft in Kern County is directly proportional to the reduction in our state project yield. So we are expected to get 50% of our state project supply. Our overdraft as of today, based on that projection, is 480,000 acre feet. That's not an accident. And so California needs to develop a new water supply project. There's not enough water, to be perfectly blunt. There's not enough water in the state, existing supplies, to provide the necessary tools that we need in order to continue the level of agricultural output from the Central Valley. The only solution that we have is demand reduction, which means economic devastation in Kern County. 25% of the irrigated agriculture, 1 million acres of irrigated ag, 250,000 will go out of production. So as far as how that plays into SGMA, as water managers, our job is to develop solutions, and hopefully we can do so and come up with creative solutions, whether it's land conversion, doing different types of things. But the biggest challenge that we face is having a reliable water supply that we can make available, whether it's urban or ag. So.
Yeah, these are things that keep you up at night, right? I would say, we're, like as Thomas pointed out, I mean, we do have parts of, at least in our area, we have parts of overdraft, the basin is overdrafted. And, I think obviously, like Eric's saying, at some point, the first thing you have to look at is, well, it's demand reduction. We don't have enough supply to serve that. And then you start looking at, what's going to happen to the school that I drive by every day to work? What's going to happen to that school? Where's the tax base going to come? I mean, you start to get into those sort of, spiraling, mind games of, this is kind of, what can we do to make it better? And I think, as Eric said, I think kind of our goal has to be of what can we do, as water managers to find solutions. And I think, we're obviously committed to that. I would say in the Sac Valley, besides just the areas where we have these areas of isolated cones of depression and overpumping, we're looking at, the state board's going to potentially come out with a new flow scenario on the Sacramento River. That's potentially going to result in probably less surface water being available in the Sacramento Valley. Thomas, and so how does that affect overall supply? How does that impact different parts of the valley? Thomas said, right now we also have areas where we have surface groundwater connection, so we're a little bit different than the San Joaquin system, where we have, rivers, creeks, and streams are still connected to the groundwater. They still have groundwater dependent ecosystems attached to them. So what do we need to be doing to provide, make sure we're securing those benefits for those creeks and streams? And then, even within our own districts, in the Sac Valley, we have species that we protect within our own boundaries, so we have giant garter snake, all kinds of birds. We have the Pacific flyway. So we're also trying to protect and manage the environment just within the area that we actually deliver water to. That's become surrogate wetlands. So that's the balance that we're trying to maintain of how do we do all these different tools, or what different tools do we need to make sure we can meet all these competing needs, and then making sure that people don't judge from the outside and say, here's what you ought to do, but actually, hey, come in the room and help us make these decisions. And, so we've tried to partner with the agencies, partner with other folks. Nature Conservancy is really working with us on the groundwater dependent ecosystems and starting to look at, surface groundwater interaction. We greatly, enjoy their participation at their ideas, their modeling. So, we're kind of saying, hey, come in, get to know our system, get to know the valley, and then help us develop solutions. I mean, that's ultimately what it's about. But I'd be selling myself short if I didn't also say, we think projects like Sites Reservoir are huge. Off-stream storage, 500,000 acre feet of new yield that could go to the environment, help in-stream flow temperatures on Sacramento River. Those are the types of projects that are out there that are pretty much economically benign and can help really advance and provide benefits to the system. And those are things that there are tools out there. I think people say, well, there's no new supply. I think there are new supplies, but we have to make sure, they're smart type projects.
So can we, go ahead, Karen, if you wanted to have a...
Well, can I advocate for
Yes.
my favorite project too? I
Yes.
work for Governor Brown, and so
Absolutely.
conveyance has to be fixed. So I'll just say that. And conveyance is a big part of this. It's also making our existing system, which is pretty broken right now, work better, but it's also understanding for our regional resiliency, are there also smaller scale projects that can be done, including conveyance east-west, not just north-south, but also smaller scale projects, really thinking intentionally about recharge, looking at those opportunities to connect to treated recycled water, capturing stormwater, and doing recharge and projects on farms that will also produce environmental benefits. And there are many, many, many examples of how we can use those molecules of water. It's done extensively in the Sacramento Valley, but there are also those opportunities in the southern San Joaquin that will help. But the bottom line is the subsidence issue that we had decades ago was somewhat solved because we figured out a way to deliver surface water to stop groundwater pumping. And somehow or the other, there still needs to be some additional water, wherever it falls and however we move it, or we fallow a lot of acres, like millions of acres.
Right. And thank you for mentioning the recharge opportunities that we have in the agricultural landscape, and maybe the two of you can talk to that end. But then also I'd like to hear, the funding was mentioned earlier. We had in the previous panel, we talked about Prop 218. We also talked on the previous panel about the opportunities of markets. What are your thoughts on water markets? Are some of these issues going to be resolved with water markets? Are some of these innovative actions like recharge in the agricultural landscape and clean recharge to address water quality issues in the agricultural landscape? Are water markets a potential good players for that? And what are you looking for in tools that the state can provide there?
So I think clearly markets are going to be part of it. In fact, with SGMA, you've introduced the market force of supply constraint. Previously, you could drill a well and have access to as much water as you needed, and now with SGMA and the limitation on that, you certainly have created the market, which ultimately, though, will drive up costs. And so I think what's going to happen is we're already seeing the conversation regarding markets in Kern County where some of the more sophisticated landowners, developers, and growers are coming forward and saying, okay, I'd like to buy some ground over here. I may never develop it, but it's got a good water right associated with it, and I need to be able to move it over to higher value crops or permanent crops over here. And so, we're going to go through a period of evaluating and identifying how these markets can be structured to work and not create impacts in maybe one area versus another. But I definitely think it'll be a necessary tool in order for us to manage and minimize the impacts associated with SGMA. So I look forward to the market concept. I think Australia has given us an excellent model to look at. There may be some things that we borrow from them and their experience, and I would expect that California will have something very similar.
Being the populist that I am, markets absolutely will be a part of this, and transfers already are, and they will continue to be, but it's just one of many. It's not the answer. And I caution people, we have already created an atmosphere that makes it extremely difficult for small and mid-sized farmers to be able to afford to be able to comply with everything that we're doing. And so we have to think very strongly about how much change and consolidation we drive, and what that means to local communities. The Australians have one model, and they have impacted rural communities, and what can we learn from that and try to keep the communities as whole as we possibly can.
I'll agree with the markets, and maybe just on the recharge issue. It is a little, I think you have to switch gears a little bit from the urban context in that, most of the ag areas and districts are recharging a lot of the groundwater system, and so some people say that's inefficient or you're wasting water. I don't know how you can say waste, that water ends up back in the groundwater system as waste, but you hear that concept. So I think it's really important to understand things from a basin level from a district level, through water balance and other ways to really understand how water gets down there. And, so a lot of us have canals that they're not lined, so we have leakage through the canal system. We have, deep percolation of some water when it's applied. I mean, all that's going back into the water table and ultimately gets reused. One of the reasons that our basin is so good in the Sacramento Valley is that's, a lot of systems are pretty much all open, and water's reused, it's picked up, it's recycled, it's reused, and some of that water, it gets back into the ground, and it keeps, our groundwater system in good shape.
So I think it's time to open this up to the audience. We have about 15 minutes left on this panel. Do we have any questions? Maybe in the back there?
Thank you.
And identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Betancourt with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, and I can't say, Secretary Ross, how pleased I am that you mentioned the health of the communities in addition to the planning. I think in a lot of our planning efforts we focus on the outcome rather than the process, and so I wonder the extent to which some of our local agencies here are thinking about including communities in economics, but also looking upstream. I am representing the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, of course, and lots of the water, surface and groundwater, comes from upstream. So I'm wondering if that's part of your planning process.
Well, certainly upper watershed management is part of the California Water Action Plan, and we understand that connectivity, and there's been a lot of good work going on in that. But I think it's hard when you're sitting trying to create what they're doing for the immediate to put all of the things we want them to factor in up front. And we don't necessarily have a dedicated state source that looks at community or rural development like USDA does. The closest we have are some of the projects that may or may not be undertaken by our Office of Policy Research, which is part of the governor's office. And so I see that as a missing link in just how we structured state government, and I think that's why we have some of the rural community issues that we do have. Not that I'm advocating larger government. I didn't want to give that. Okay.
Fed, thoughts on the local level?
Yeah, I guess I would add, I think, we live and work in our communities, so I think, it's important to know that they're always part of this conversation, so reaching out to, the single, the counties are very interested in, for example, single family homes that are on a domestic well that are kind of out in the countryside, making sure they have, stable water supply as well as our small communities. So we want them at the table. They are at the table. Some of them asked to be eligible GSA, so we want to make sure they're in the governance. I think we always look upstream, so totally support the efforts you guys do in the watersheds. It's vital important, and it's good that there's always actions getting funded up there. I think one of the other things that we're going to have to do within our GSP is there has to be a pretty robust outreach effort to make sure you are reaching locals, the tribes, and others to make sure they are all inclusive in the process. So, how that affects upstream folks, I don't know if we send letters all the way up into the watersheds, but I would say, more the better. So, if there's an opportunity to come and participate, there's always a seat there, and would appreciate that from the areas that are upstream of us.
Eric, any thoughts?
No,
You got the whole southern Sierra Nevada to yourself there.
Yes, we do. No, I think Thad touched on it. It's an outreach effort, and everyone's a stakeholder, whether you're in the valley floor in the basin itself, or whether you're involved in the water supply in its place of origin.
So let's maybe take a question over here. Over there.
Hello, my name is Pamela Rosada. I'm with the California Research Bureau. We're part of the California State Library. I don't know if this is a comment or a question. I think it's a little bit of both. I heard a lot of discussion up there about trust and data, two things that often go weirdly hand in hand, maybe. As we're building this new system, and I also heard that we're not necessarily the managing state entity up on the stage, but we do have some local folks here, right? As we're building this system, let's look to other systems, like the healthcare system, for example, and see things where at the local level, that sharing of data is so incredibly difficult. So as much as possible as you're building this system, be mindful of that. What are the reporting requirements going to be? Maybe the state could come up with their guidelines before rather than after those systems start getting created, so that we would have a way to meaningfully, reasonably, safely, and trustingly collect that data in the future. What are the obstacles to doing that? I guess if there's a question in there, what are the obstacles to doing that at the local level and maybe even the state level, if you can speak to that a bit, Madam Secretary? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. I think you put your fingers right on the pulse of things here. And we also had Bill this year on data framework, for a water data framework, and I know DWR is very engaged in already as part of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and building these data frameworks. Any thoughts on this comment from a librarian, a data librarian?
I think some of the challenges, and let me touch on the trust issue. What we see is a bifurcation of interests into what I call the haves and have-nots. And those that have a water supply are very protective and don't want to share data because it demonstrates that they do. And their concern is that those that are on the other side of the equation are going to come and somehow try to gain access. And so fortunately, SGMA does require reporting, and it is intended to be transparent. And frankly, for a basin to move forward, everybody, and Thad and I have touched on this a little bit, and before the presentation started, we were talking. Everybody in the basin has to move forward in lockstep and at the same pace. This coordination requirement is extensive, and so I literally cannot prepare my plan until I understand what everybody's data is. In fact, the beauty of SGMA is all the puzzle pieces have to be able to fit together, and the picture has to be clear, which is very different than what it has been in the past. We had double counting issues and all kinds of challenges because the data was never presented in a way that you could really look at it. And so I think we're addressing that. But for me, the biggest challenge is you've got haves and have-nots, and some groups don't want to share their data because of that.
Any other thoughts? Question over here.
Yeah, hi, Jack Hawks, California Water Association. Secretary Ross, since you seem to be enjoying speaking on behalf of your sister agencies, I'll direct this one to you, but certainly Thad and Eric can answer as well.
So in trouble after.
Yeah, I know. It's a two-part question, though. The first one is, how do you all think the problem of the overlapping GSAs that are forming over the priority basins is ultimately going to resolve itself? And the adjunct to that is, as you know, certain water agencies are being excluded from some GSAs, but not others, and including some of my own members. But it's we get to the point. How do you think that problem is going to resolve itself, especially if the excluded entities, whether they're urban agencies or ag districts or whatever, if their groundwater rights have been abridged, or if there are fees, if they feel like in the GSPs they're going to have fee structures that are going to unduly harm them, and the recourse, of course, is litigation. But do you think that the Water Board, as it approves or goes through the groundwater sustainability plans and actually approves them, do you think that these problems can be resolved at that point before you get to litigation? That's my question.
Is it the mutual water agencies that
and
need
IOU,
legislation?
It's IOUs as well. There's a number of them. So
Yeah, there's some private companies and
Yeah,
city
but-
irrigation districts.
Because they don't have authority to be a part of that, and that almost requires the county. Okay.
I guess maybe I'll take a shot and then let Secretary follow up. I would say, the overlap issue, obviously the big issue there was when SGMA was really, first time it was written, it said, hey, you had to basically, respond within 90 days if you had concern about overlap, and that's why everybody, took off and did all these filings, and then SB 12 fixed that. So, I think now we're kind of back in, everybody's got to play nice, what you have on there doesn't work. So, I think, and again, credit to DWR and the administration, they've given dollars for facilitators to come in and really help to clear up that issue. So I think everybody is serious about trying to get the overlap issue resolved by next summer. That's our focus in making sure that we can submit to something DWR that works. The state board has done a great job with being the stick, and I wouldn't want to be in their position, but they've done a great job saying, hey, if you don't get this right, we're going to step in, and that has helped to make sure people stay at the table. So, I think for the most part, you're going to see things work out in June. There'll probably be a few outliers, but I think everybody's committed to that. Secondly, on, like in our area, we do have mutuals, independent small districts that aren't GSA eligible, and that's where the county has stepped in and assumed to sort of protect them. And so that's why, from our perspective, it's very important to get the county supervisors, county councils to make sure they're committed to protecting those stakeholders, if you will, and engaging in the process and making sure they're engaged. I mean, obviously some tough decisions are coming, but the county's got to be the one. I keep saying they've always had this authority. Before SGMA signed, the county's always had the authority to do the things that they're now being asked to do. And we're saying, you got to do it now. It's, I get it, it's going to be a tough election, whatever, but you guys got to step up. I mean, this is the time to do it. So we're holding the counties accountable.
So lots of new things to learn. Thank you. Any additional comments? Take a question from over here. Yes?
Thank you very much for your comments. My name is Linda Seifert. I'm a supervisor in Solano County, and I also sit with my other board colleagues and all of our local mayors on our water agency, which is pretty much leading the SGMA process in our county. What's very interesting is a lot of things you're saying about the process are true, and I would say that it certainly is demonstrated that the truth is that water is for fighting. It's probably one of the most challenging processes that I've seen as long as I've served as an elected official, because I don't think that it's about today. I mean, where we sit in Solano County, I would call us a county of great abundance with water. And so we don't look at it today as where the shortages are, but for the future about when that might happen, which will be probably hopefully many generations, if at all, from where we are today. But when we get to that point, I mean, I do think it's incumbent on those that serve in public office and are ultimately going to be making these choices as we look at it now, to anticipate, who sits on those boards, who are really going to make the decisions, and what that decision process is going to be, so that the interests of ag as well as our municipal interests are protected both. And I do think that ultimately the challenge is going to be in making the assessment about where those priorities are. And so, to me, when I listen to what is being said, it seems to me that what we're sort of ignoring really are that the problems aren't really there as much today as they potentially will be in the long haul. I'm not really sure what the question is in that, but it's truly proven to be one of the, I think, in many ways divisive, and I do believe the divisiveness is because no one can predict the future. So, whatever, I mean, I appreciate any thoughts in that regard.
And that's where the tools that allow, if you've got the good data, to feed a tool to allow you to sit together with scenario planning so that everybody can see if this is the way we want to grow, this is the kind of agriculture we want to continue to provide a rural lifestyle for people who want to live in the country, and we want to make sure our citizens have drinking water and that we have a healthy environment. You can start to play out the scenarios. If you take this much water out, what does that mean? And I think those kinds of real-time scenario planning tools are one of the best ways in a community setting to have people sit and vision together what these decisions, if we went this way, what would that mean? And I'm not sure that there's enough of that that's readily available at the local use, and it requires investment. But I think it's one of the smartest things we could do, because literally we are talking about what do we want the Central Valley to look like? What do we want your community to look like? And that we've got these competing and equally beneficial uses, but what do we want it to look like? Because we are making the decisions today that are going to shape that, and we may or may not be able to back out of them if we aren't smart about it.
Eric?
Well, I was just going to say, I think you touched on one of the uncomfortable tensions that exist in this process from a Central Valley perspective, is you have the urbanized areas that represent 10% of the overall water use, but they represent the vast majority of the population, obviously. And from a voting standpoint, the Board of Supervisors are always interested and concerned about where their votes will be coming from. And so it was fascinating to watch the political maneuvering that was occurring as we were drafting this JPA, because we had to figure out how can we give them a voice to make sure that they had input into the process, but yet also protect the users of the water, which in Kern County is 95% agriculture. And so we're always trying to figure out how to make everybody feel like they're valued and they're part of the process and not exclude anybody, but it does create that uncomfortable tension. And I think SGMA is going to highlight that. And so I frequently hear the Mark Twain quote, and I think it's absolutely true. I would offer Ben Franklin's quote, you know the worth of water when the well goes dry. So.
Yeah. Question over here. Shut it down? Okay, we're at the end of the session. I've been told we're done. I think these were some great concluding remarks. You have learned, hopefully, some from this. Thank you.